Hi, friends. Welcome to the Genesis of Shame podcast. I'm your host, Sam Landa, and I'm here to help you speak biblical truth to the shame you experience in relationships. My hope is that you grow in your understanding of how shame impacts you so you can learn how to connect with God and others. If you've experienced fear, hiding who you are, boundary issues, anxiety, and/or depression in your relationships, then this podcast is for you. It's time to speak truth to your shame. Hi everyone, welcome back again to the Genesis of Shame podcast, and I thank you for being here. This has really been a long journey. It's been a good journey, and I am just so excited to be here now on episode 33, I believe this is. Actually, no, it's episode 34. Pretty crazy to think about that. But we're getting really close to that big number 50, and I look forward to celebrating that with you guys soon. But on another note, just thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys for the reviews. Thank you guys for commenting on some of these topics. And yeah, just keep those coming, as they always are encouraging to hear and to read. And it really motivates me to continue to do this podcast. So I really hope it's been a blessing. That's really why I do it, to help you in your own relationships with other believers and people in general, and also in your relationship with God, by understanding how shame impacts both of those relationships. So again, as always, I just want to ask that if you are listening right now, if you can just remember to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and also, just as you're listening right now, just click share on Facebook and share on Instagram and get the word out. And hopefully it's a blessing to many, many others. With that being said, today I'm interviewing a mentor of mine. When I was in grad school, she really helped me hone in on my basic counseling skills. And I am very grateful to her for helping me in that area. And it's definitely something that I always remember even today as I counsel students. Today's my interview with Dr. O'Hare, and hope you guys enjoy it. I appreciate you doing this, Doctor. I really do. It's a good
Carmela.
Do
speech therapy with
So for those of you guys who are listening, I think one of the things that you'll hear me refer to Dr. O as Dr. O. But one of the things that she told us very early on in our career is that at some point when we graduate and we become professionals, that we can now refer to them by their first name. And I just am unable to do that. So Dr. O is currently training me how to say Carmela. It still sounds weird. I can't. But guys, thank you guys for being here today. Today's a real special episode that I'm doing with Dr. O'Hare, or Carmela. Still weird. And we're talking about shame, which is the theme of this podcast, the Genesis of Shame. And we're also going to talk about how God attachment and God image play into our view of shame. And Dr. O has done a lot of, I think she did a dissertation on God image. Mm-hmm. And so she has a lot of content, great content to give on this topic. And Dr. O, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here with you.
But yeah, so today we're talking about shame. And I know it's a topic that we both were just talking about, how it's a big part of the church, where we wouldn't think to see it as much, but it's actually where we see it a lot. A lot of shame and a lot of shaming. Mm-hmm. So people come into church feeling shame for their past or for current situations that they're in, but then also brothers and sisters shaming those people or shaming each other. Mm-hmm. So I think it would help our audience if we just kind of get an overview of what shame is. You know, we often talk about it as it being this I am talk as opposed to an I do talk. But can you give us an operating definition for shame?
I see shame as one of the strong elements in self-identity, or can be if you have a high degree of shame. And it starts from really young. Yeah. You know, and oftentimes I don't think that parents or even older siblings realize how much they can affect the very young child, you know, even the toddler, in the way they respond to them when they do something wrong, you know, because it becomes part of their identity, that shame, like I'm not good enough. And so that grows from childhood, and then if you have a shame-based identity, you're more likely to try to hide yourself and be separate from people. Because I know we're going to be talking about attachment and God image too. But that whole attachment can be affected very much if a child doesn't feel safe because they feel shamed.
Yeah. And what are some of those shaming messages that you think are most common? Because parents, I was talking not too long ago about the good enough parent with Dr. Thomas. And we were saying how parents, for the most part, want to do their best, but there are times where they may lose their cool or they just may be acting in the moment and they say something that they don't want to say. Right. And there's a difference, I think, between that parent and then the parent who is in this constant mode of shaming their child. But what are some common statements or messages that you've heard people
mention? I think even if you look at how it can get passed down through a family tree, because most parents, unless they're very deliberate, parent like their parent did, and then their parent before them. And so a lot of the messages that the child receives, even if it's not what the parent means to say, is, I'm not good enough. You're not good enough because you wet your pants, or because you didn't eat your dinner, or because you didn't wash your hands, or whatever. It doesn't matter what the behavior it is, but it's the way that is presented, that somehow you're diminished as a person because you didn't or you did something that was unacceptable.
And how does that then affect them later on? So they take that identity as children, and then how does that affect them in their teenage years? How does that affect them in their adult years?
Well, if they're already looking at themselves as not good enough, then they're going to do anything to please other people to try to make themselves acceptable. So, and sometimes the things that they're doing to make themselves acceptable are really not healthy things.
True.
If they get in with the wrong crowd, well, they might want to be acceptable by doing drugs or being sexually promiscuous. So they're giving power over to other people so that they somehow can feel accepted.
Well, so as a people-pleasing element to it. Okay. And I think with in adulthood, how does that play out? So it's people-pleasing, but how does someone get over that aspect? Because if they're trying to be good enough and they never please that person enough, they continue going into that cycle, right?
Well, I guess there's the clinical answer and there's the spiritual answer.
Yeah, let's do both.
I'll start with spiritual because I think that's more positive and more powerful, is allowing God to identify who you are, to give you identity. When God speaks, if we really do hear him, transformation happens.
Yeah.
It just does. I know in my own life, when God says something to me, like sometimes immediate transformation happens. But of course, if people are shame-based, they're oftentimes afraid to go to God because they're not worthy. But of course, none of us are worthy, but God still loves us anyhow. But a lot of the work I do with young people is trying to encourage them to hear from God. That should be a normal Christian behavior. And yet, a lot of times when you ask people, well, what do you hear God saying? They'll look at you like, what are you talking about? So having that relationship instead of religion.
Sure, yeah.
But relationship's very hard for people who carry a lot of shame because they need to hide. If you even think back to where did shame start? It started right in the garden. And those fig leaves were meant to hide their shame for Adam and Eve, so they were hiding from God. So that was the initial first experience of shame in the human race.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And that's how really all of this this podcast got started. I would meet with students and there was so much shame always, and more so, which I guess I knew that it would happen in the Christian church, but I didn't expect it to be as much as I've seen, because I work with, it's college students. So they're coming from all these different backgrounds. But to your point about hearing from God, another thing that I've seen impact shame is you can't hear from God if you're not reading his word. You can't hear from God if you're not praying. You can't hear from God if you're not around Christian community. And that's been dropping significantly. Barna does a lot of research with that. And I think it was like 30% of people maybe go to church once a month, and the same percentage, around the same percentage, don't read their Bibles. So how can you hear from God if you're not reading His Word? And I think that because that's dropped in this next generation, the new generation, I think that plays a huge role in that.
But it's also how they're reading His Word, too. That's one of the things, if it's just a discipline because I have to check off that I read a chapter or whatever you think is acceptable, but you're not really hearing God in it.
Meditating.
And allowing it to because we can read all sorts of things, but to really hear God's voice to us, what is God saying to you about that? And then two, people, even if they're haven't read God's Word that day, God can still talk to us personally in prayer time. So I like that you said prayer or the Word, but then again too, there's times that God just speaks, but maybe people don't recognize it's His voice either.
A lot of what they hear is maybe their parents' voice, which ties into our topic, right, about God image and God attachment. You did your dissertation on God image. What did you find? What was it like to do that project?
It was interesting because the research I did, of course, the lit review was interesting, just reading hundreds of articles on God image. It was a great topic because there's a lot published on it, and all the correlation between parental image and God image. And then, but what I did was I did trying to think how many week group now. We're talking a bunch of years ago that I did this, but I did a group with a group of people, and it was a God-centered kind of group. And as we worked through issues that people had as far as with their parents and other conflicts in their life, and then also including God in it. So we did before measures and after measures, seeing how, especially the ones who had some real breakthroughs, how much their God image improved during that time. The girl that I actually included a case study of in my dissertation was a gal who had been sexually abused, and of course had lots of shame because of it. And but then working that through in the group, she had drastic changes in her measures and the different instruments we use to measure God image and things like that. So a lot of times, and I think that's one of the good things about Christian-based counseling, because you're not just working on your human relationships, but on the primary one, your relationship with God.
And I know for us, we know and understand God image and what it is, but for the audience, can you define that for them, what God image is?
Well, it's how you perceive God.
It's how we perceive God.
So like you can see Him as an angry God or a judging God, a distant God, so there's all different kinds of things. So if you were to even just put a title of how you see God, or like if I said to you, well, how would you describe your parents? You might say, I have loving parents, I have generous parents, well, those same kinds of titles would be the kind of ways we would describe God also. So God image is all those adjectives that we'd use to describe the relationship between me and God and how I see God.
Yeah. And then for those who see Him more negatively, what's the impact?
Punishing.
Of that? Okay.
Distant. Damning. Okay. Withholding.
As we're talking about this, I start thinking about my own upbringing, and I got a lot of the justice God, the faithful God, and so on. But one of the things that was hardest for me to learn was believing God's promises or trusting in His promises. And a lot of that, to your point about our parents, for my dad, he would promise me things if I got honor roll, if I did this, if I did that, and I would wait and it would never come. So when I would read through the Psalms, for me, it was hard to look at those promises and believe. Like I believed it in my mind, but I don't know if I believed it in my heart that it would come to pass. And then as I started to look at Abraham, Moses, all of the prophets and believers in the Old Testament, they had to wait years before those promises came to fruition. I think that helped me a lot in readjusting my God image, and now I've been working more so on the grace aspect. I think maybe you've seen that too, where there's this strong commitment to truth, but at the same time, trying to apply grace with that truth, because grace is a part of the truth.
Grace is so important.
Yeah.
One of the acronyms for grace is God's riches at Christ's expense.
Nice.
Because grace means we haven't earned it, but he still gives it to us. So that shows a side of God. But if you've had, like, I grew up in a family where I got punished for the things I did wrong. I didn't understand or experience grace. But you did something wrong, although I could outrun my mother, so sometimes I did get away with things. She would chase me with that strap, but I was faster. So grace was that bathroom door that separated her from me. But yeah, if you did something wrong, and what happened as a child, my way of trying to get out of trouble was to lie a lot. I would deny it all the time because I always knew there was going to be punishment. So any of you parents out there, if you're noticing your kids lying a lot and you know they're lying, it's likely because they're fearful of the consequence. So maybe a different approach is needed. Not that they should necessarily get away with it, but they need some kind of approach that's going to help them to understand, okay, even let them choose their own punishment is sometimes a good way of doing it. Yeah,
I mean, I think that's a really great point, because they do have parents who listen in, and they do have younger children. And I think those first 8-10 years, I mean, I work with a lot of students at that age, growing up, and that's something that I saw. If the parents miss that age range, it's hard to start establishing rules and changing your position on care and grace when they're teenagers, because they only know what they've seen the previous 10 years. Not that it can't change, but I have seen that be a very strong effect on how they're raised when they're younger.
One thing I don't know if you realized, I had done a good bit of foster care at one point in my life, so sometimes a kid would do something wrong and they'd want to know, what's my punishment? I'd be like, you don't want to know now, because let me calm down so I can make a reasonable decision. So one of the things, like if we look at God as the angry God, because that's how we experienced our parents, and the punishment sometimes is bigger than what the crime was really, then we see God as a very damning God, because we've picked that up from the way our parents respond to us.
Yeah. For those of us who were disciplined growing up, sometimes I look back and I say, you know what, during those times though, one thing I can say about my dad, which was very powerful for me, was that he was never abusive. He was never angry. So I also don't want the audience to kind of get that picture either. But if I did something wrong, I got punished for it. So that kind of kept those boundaries of, here's the extent of where you can go with this. So is there some good to that, right? Is there some good to having those strong boundaries, to seeing God as someone who will punish, because he does punish sin? So there is that element to it. So how do we distinguish between that? I think that's a concern for many of us.
Well, God punishes sin, but then he also gives grace.
Right.
So it's like, not everything we do wrong needs to be punished by our parents. Like, so you spill milk. If you're not being careless, it just spilled. Why would you punish the kid? The kid's already feeling bad about it. So they're, in some ways, already kind of self-blaming. So you don't want to add to that, So I think we have to have some flexibility, There's times that we make mistakes. But sin has to have volition, I think. You have to be doing something on purpose.
Okay.
It's not just doing something wrong, but it's purposely doing something wrong. You're fracturing in some way that relationship with God. But I think if you come from a family that discipline is so strict, and so rigid, then you think anytime you do something wrong, that you should be ashamed of it. Instead of, I'm human, I make mistakes.
Or you question if even something that isn't a sin, you question, is this wrong or am I doing it with the right motives? I think that's another aspect of it as well.
Yeah.
Because everything that I do is attached to this evil motive or something like that. No, that's a good point. And then you have Italian background, Hispanic background, and we both kind of have that idea of what it looks like to be, to have that strong authority figure in our lives, I think. So for me, I think that was my journey, is learning the grace aspect, still holding to truth, but also learning that grace is needed. So I'm learning that with my boys, So as we're talking about this, I'm reflecting and learning a lot as we talk. So with God image, what is something that you recommend for people to do to kind of help them see God in a different light? And see that caring, because we do see the positive effects. When you see God as a loving God, we see that it influences how people feel in general. Less depression, less anxiety from that aspect. But a lot of it also stems from parents. So it's hard to discern which one's which.
Well, I think once you get old enough, like just even like if you think, I was thinking of it almost like allergies. If you don't know you're allergic to something and you keep on being exposed to that allergen, you're going to react to it. But once you know that you have this allergy, you remove that allergen from your atmosphere, whether it's not eating something or maybe not using a certain perfume or cologne or whatever, you realize what the cause is. Well, as we realize, okay, some of my God image is based on former relationships, authority relationships, then you have to re-examine the way you look at God and realize, does this line up with what the Bible says about God? So you remove those stimuli from other relationships that have so colored your relationship with God. You have to be deliberate about it. And here's the prayer that God loves to answer. God, reveal yourself to me. He's delighted when people pray that prayer. He wants people to know him because he wants that relationship with each and every one of us. But of course, just like anything, we're oftentimes going to fall back into those old thoughts. Like I was talking to you when you first came about how Tucker had been abused. And if you move your hand fast, he'll still, even though he's over a lot of that abuse, but he still at times will react because that fear is still in him. Well, for all of us, in some ways we've been brainwashed, not intentionally, but our brain has responded to that stimuli. So it takes a while for us to change. But if we keep on exposing ourselves to God's love, and keep on seeking him, the Bible says, if you seek me, you will find me. If you seek me with all of your heart, I will be found by you. And so it's in that seeking of who he truly is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you mentioned abuse, and I think that is something that we see a lot of: verbal abuse, physical abuse, and I know someone right now who shares about that, about his father, how abusive he was, and it's so hard to see God as a loving God, as a God who wants to be with him and wants for him to know him. Right? What do you say to people who maybe have had that experience? I know this is not a counseling session where they may need to process a lot, but just as a starting point, what would you recommend for that person who has experienced abuse in that way?
Yeah. Well, I would very much encourage them to get into some good counseling.
Yeah.
And preferably a Christian counselor if they're seeking God, because that person can help them with that too. There's certain interventions that we use that allows God to speak into our past and reveal truth, and it's just amazing how much can change when we truly do have a sense of what God's saying to us. It's funny, I was reading about creation today, and I'm thinking, if God spoke and was able to create this whole universe, that shows us the power of his words.
That's awesome.
So he can recreate who we are and heal by speaking to us if we're receptive to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's good. I always think about Jesus when he talks about him being the vine and us being the branches. All of our source of nutrients, of growth comes from him. And to your point about his words, that's what makes the difference, and that's what makes the change. It's interesting, as you're mentioning Genesis 2, because everything before the fall was perfect. Everything before the fall, relationship with him, the messaging between maybe him and Eve as well, Adam and Eve. But then after that, sin enters, there's fear. Adam says, I was afraid, so I went and hid. So fear is a big factor there. And how does that play a role? Because I think fear does play a huge role into shame.
It separates us from God. Separation. There's the healthy fear, which would be better described as awe or respect, and that's good. Just like if you were, with someone important to you, you have that kind of act a little bit different. You're not as casual with the person, although God and I are pretty casual. I think that's just my Brooklyn. But so, yeah, part of it is allowing yourself to spend time thinking about who God is, maybe even being with people who reflect God's attributes. Be around people who seem to know God well and who seem to be a lot like him, because they can love you in a way that maybe you haven't been loved before.
Yeah, absolutely. And all that plays a role into, how we view God, our past experiences, and then how we attach ourselves to God, how we relate to God. And in this particular case, you've mentioned already that we hide ourselves from God. And that would be reflective of who? The anxious person or the avoidant person, or both?
Yeah, both, definitely.
Yeah. So how does the anxious person respond to God?
Well,
and the avoidant
they might
person?
be trying to obey God, but in an impulsive way, just to keep God calm. Because anxiety often comes out of some kind of trauma.
Okay.
So trying to kind of manage their environment. They're going to do everything right, and they're worried if I didn't do it right, what's going to happen? All this kind of stuff. So they're overworking themselves.
Performance-based.
You've taught, I've taught. You can tell who your anxious students are.
Yeah. Yeah.
I still remember the first time we met. You were a little anxious.
I was, yep.
Before that first assignment was due, you came to meet with me. And then after the first assignment to see what you could do better.
Right.
So, which is interesting. That. You can tell the anxious person needs everything to be just quite right. Turn the sound down on that. And because they're so afraid of doing something wrong, because maybe at home they would get really in trouble if they did something wrong. And
it was also a performance thing or a people-pleasing thing. At least I recognize that for myself, is how can I impress, in a way, my teachers, my professors. So I confirm
well, you
that.
were impressive, so don't worry about it.
Thanks, Drew.
But yeah, it's interesting. And then, of course, those who have been really through traumatic events, that need to control the environment and stuff like that. And some people are mad at God when things don't turn out. I see this oftentimes when people have an expectation of how God should manage a situation, and it doesn't happen that way because God never steps over someone's free will. So so as a kid, my dad was an alcoholic, and I used to pray all the time that God would stop him from doing that. And so I don't think I blamed God, but someone could blame God for that. Why didn't he hear my prayers? But my dad was not a religious man at all, but I've seen a lot of people who get really angry at God because God didn't stop bad things from happening. So they really, that causes a lot of problems.
Yeah. And then for the avoidant, they're pulling. It sounds like that's an avoidant person. They would pull away from God. And if I can't trust God, I'm gonna do things by myself. I'm gonna do it on my own. So they kind of white knuckle their way through life almost.
Yeah, can't trust anyone.
Yeah. And to that point, that affects their human relationships.
Oh yeah.
How many more? I talk a lot about relationships. And we do talk a lot about attachment. And one of the common things that I find is that either you have the people-pleasing person in a relationship trying to do everything they can, high anxiety, always wanting to do things better, and then you have the other person who is avoidant and not really caring, just doing their own thing. And how does that shape their view of God in any way, right? They're already seeing God in a negative light, but how do their human relationships affect Christian community, their view of God?
Well, I think the avoidant person is afraid to get close, afraid to be hurt, afraid to be impacted. I remember this one client I had who was so avoidant that he lived in an apartment building. It was up in Massachusetts. And he lived on the first floor, he would actually go out the window to come in and out of his apartment so he wouldn't have to meet people in the hallway.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And the only place he wasn't avoidant was he would play basketball games with people, but he even used a different name and had no relationship with the people. He just liked playing basketball.
Wow.
But he was a very damaged person. Probably the only person he ever really came and talked to was to me in counseling.
Yeah.
So no relationship with God. So, and he would never go into what happened in his earlier life. So, yeah. So
did he keep going to counseling?
I think I had him for client I worked there for 3 years. I think I probably had him for at least 2 years, the last 2 years I was there. Yeah. And he'd always show up.
Yeah.
So that was
you were
kind
in
of
a safe
interesting.
space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting. Yeah. So there's some kind of fracture that happens. Some kind of break happens that pushes people beyond their resources.
Yeah.
And once they cut themselves off from people and cut themselves off from God, it's hard to get in there. Yeah. It's just, it's very interesting. I think I stopped working there in 2003, so that's a long time ago, but certain people just really, I still remember a lot of their cases and a lot of the details of them. And working community mental health, I couldn't introduce the topic of God, but if they brought up God, then I can engage with them in it. So that was always interesting.
Yeah. And it at some point, it does seem to be the one thing missing, right? Where people seem to have everything together, but they still feel like something's missing. I want to say that one of the famous quarterbacks mentioned something like that. They told him, you have money, you have a beautiful wife, you have all these, this fame, but are you happy? And he said, no, I still feel there's something missing. And it's always that reminder to me how, God created us and created us for a relationship with Him. So even if we have everything else, in a sense, we're still seeking Him.
And what should that relationship look like? Because there's a lot of people who think just going to church on Sundays is okay. Like I paid my dues, but they really don't have a relationship. As I always say, religion is not good enough. It needs to be relationship. And I think a lot of people have more religion than relationship.
A lot of Pharisees.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure that they want to be Pharisees. I think it's just that they have not been exposed to different. If you grew up in a family that was religion, I grew up in a very religious family as far as my dad wasn't, but, took us to church all the time, was very religious oriented, but it wasn't until when I was in my 20s that I really had a personal relationship with the Lord. And my mom started checking out what I was doing and joined in what I was doing. And so her relationship changed with the Lord. Yeah. She was always very religious at church. I mean, I grew up Catholic. She was at church every day. So I think there was certainly a love of God, but I'm not sure there was that strong relationship because she was always very anxious. But I saw the change happening in her as she developed more of a relationship with God.
Yeah.
And she grew up with a very strict father. Her dad was very strict. So, I guess you have to find out who the real Jesus is.
Yeah, yeah. And all of this plays a role into how we view God, right? How we attach to each other, how we attach to God. What are some thoughts that you have in general about maybe the current culture? We were just talking before we started about how this new generation is very anti-God, or God does not have a role in my life. I'll accept that he's there, but doesn't have a role in my life. I mean, how can we help this next generation still see the importance of God? Because it is very anti-God and very be all for you type of culture.
I think developing relationships with them, we influence more by who we are than what we say.
It's true. Yeah.
Talk is cheap.
Yeah.
But who we are, and if they can see something different in us, then they might look towards why is there something different.
So high engagement.
Yeah.
Need to have.
Yeah. It's interesting and a lot of times it takes a while before they see that difference, because it's almost like a brainwash. Like, well, I'm doing this, and this, and that's what they've been taught, or what has been, modeled for them. But there's still that emptiness. We were talking too about how, each generation seems to become more and more sexualized, and because they're trying to fill some kind of way of attaching. But the promiscuousness that is even part of a lot of Christian people, it's not satisfying. So relationships, or even the high divorce rate among Christians. Like when I was a kid, I knew one of my friends was the only one that had parents that was divorced. So there's just a lot of disruption, but in families because of divorce, but I think a lot of times there's just not that secure base because we don't have that relationship with the Lord. So we're looking for everything else to somehow satisfy. And if it doesn't satisfy, well, then I'm going to choose someone else.
Yeah, it's true. You do see that a lot. And a lot of that stems from insecurity, right? Not feeling safe in a relationship. How does one move to secure relationship? I know just in general, because if someone is anxious, I do want to give them hope. Your attachment can change with time.
Yeah.
So if you're avoidant, if you're anxious, it can change to a secure attachment.
Right.
How do we walk?
Community is one thing. Like if your church has small groups, and they're healthy small groups where you can really have good, healthy relationship with other Christians who will pour into you. Definitely, if there's a lot of real serious break, again, the counseling, I'm always going to pitch Christian counseling. And of course, your relationship with God, so it's, it's important. Community, that's what church should really be, is community, not just someplace I go once a week.
Right.
And it's fun. Like I've been in the same small group for like 3 years, and I've watched people grow in this small group. I've watched, people blossom and grow and receive healing just from being in community. Yeah,
I've definitely seen that as well. Yeah. So it's kind of like not going to church, relating to Lord with intention, that you want to get to know him, and ways to know him are through Christian community or through prayer and so on. But any final thoughts, Dr. that you have just on the topic in general, or just anything that you would like to share with the audience about yourself, or just anything?
I would just say, don't ever give up on God. Realize, don't keep on doing the same thing. Sometimes we keep on doing the same thing over and over again, expect different results. Go and ask someone. Look at someone who has what you want, who's a Christian and say, how did you get to where you are? And see if they'll mentor you in that.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
Dr. Rowe, thank you for doing this. Thank you for joining together and talking about this topic. Speaking of mentoring, being a mentor through my grad experience, it's been a pleasure to do this. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you again, guys, for tuning in to today's episode. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to listen to this podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the show, and if possible, please leave a review as it helps with the ranking for this podcast. I really appreciate you guys, and I hope you guys can tune in next week. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.